それでは早速開催させていただきます。司会の国境なき医師団の久留宮です。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。さて、日本国内でも新型コロナウイルスの第3波が拡大しつつある中、新型コロナワクチンの開発状況や政府によるワクチン購入予定数など、これら治療薬については様々な報道が続いています。開発途中にあるワクチンをめぐっては、ワクチンナショナリズムという言葉が登場するほど、各国の自国中心主義が国際保健における需要や国際協力の必要性を押し隠している状況が見受けられます。しかしながら、人道的な観点からは、全世界規模で流行する新型コロナウイルスの対応には国際的な協力が不可欠であり、政治・経済的な大国だけではなく、医療体制が脆弱な国や地域において、人道援助の対象となる弱い立場の人々にも、ワクチン、治療薬、検査ツールが届くよう公平な分配が必要です。本セッションでは、この医薬品アクセスの問題に取り組んでいる3名の演者の方々に、現在も議論が続いている国際社会の連携のあるべき姿、その現状や課題についてお話ししていただきます。それではまず演者の方々を紹介させていただきます。まずお一人目は、シルビー・ブリアン先生です。ブリアン先生はウイルス疾患を含む多くの病原体の予防およびコントロールの国際的な取り組みを推進する WHO 感染リスク管理エピデミック・パンデミック疾患対策部のディレクターで、これまで鳥インフルエンザ、エボラ、ジカ熱、ペスト、黄熱病、コレラ、MERS など、さまざまな疾患の検知、対応準備に対処されてきました。次にご紹介するのは中谷香織さんです。中谷さんは研究開発の面から途上国での医薬品アクセスの問題に取り組む特定非営利活動法人 DNDi Japan の事務局代表です。今年1月に代表に着任されるまで、日本やアメリカの NPO 以外に UNAIDS、JICA などの国際機関、公的機関でアフリカ、カリブ、東南アジアの各地域における感染症やユニバーサルヘルスカバレッジなどの公衆衛生分野を中心に、プロジェクト運営、技術協力、人材育成など、多岐にわたる活動をしてこられた経歴の持ち主です。そして最後にご紹介するのはシドニー・ウォン先生です。ウォン先生は公衆衛生の専門家であり、現在国境なき医師団アクセスキャンペーンの共同ディレクターを務めています。アクセスキャンペーンは国境なき医師団が1999年ノーベル平和賞の賞金をもとに開始した活動であり、
This team advocates to break down the systemic barriers that prevent equitable access to
あるいは貧しい地域特有の病気に対してそもそも治療薬が存在しないとか、副作用の強い薬しかない、診断方法が活動地の環境では使えないなど、こうした医療アクセスの障壁に苦しむ人々に
very
対して、
many or variety of barriers for access to medicines which is needed. And
開発と利用の促進を求める活動です。ウォン先生はこれまでに国境なき医師団の医療ディレクターを7年間務めるなど、グローバルヘルス分野での経験は15年に及び、援助の必要な現場で医療活動に従事してきました。また、ウォン先生はこのような環境下で医療の質を保ち、改善していく倫理的フレームワークの実用化も活動の分野としています。それでは、まずは WHO のブリアン先生からご発表をお願いします。
Good morning. Okay, thank you very much for your invitation to this meeting. I will share my slide presentation. Okay, so I will speak about
で、私の方からはこの新型コロナ
COVID-19 vaccine therapeutic and diagnostic and talk about the ACT Accelerator, which is a new partnership that has been launched in April 2020. So just a snapshot of the global situation. We have now 59 million cases reported to WHO and more than 1.4 million deaths. The countries that are more effective in terms of cumulative number of cases are the United States of America, India, Brazil, Russian Federation, and France. And the countries currently reporting more deaths are United States of America, Brazil, India, Mexico, and United Kingdom. But of course, those statistics can change from one day to another because the situation is extremely dynamic currently. And also these are representing only crude number of cases and deaths. And it doesn't account of about the size of the country or the population size in particular. So this is why many months ago, a partnership was created called ACT-A to promote fair and equitable access to COVID-19 response tool, but mostly medical countermeasures, because currently we are dealing with this pandemic using only what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions. But then the point is to include medical countermeasure in this response. So it's a broad partnership, and you see the partner on the screen. So what was really interesting in April when this was launched is really, it was not only a partnership about access, but really an end-to-end process, starting from to the research part, to the development of product, the production, and then equitable access. And so the aim of ACT-A was really to accelerate this process because, as you know, developing new product for a new disease often can take many years. And so the point was really to accelerate this and making sure that we can have something before the end of this pandemic. So this partnership is an extremely broad partnership because in addition to the partners that were mentioned earlier, it brings together governments, scientists, businesses, civil society, and philanthropists, and global health organization, because of course UNICEF, WFP, and others are also part of this mechanism. And the aim of this partnership was really first to support the development and equitable distribution of test, treatment, and vaccine, but also with the aim to restore full societal and economic activity, because as you know, COVID-19 pandemic has an impact not only on health, but also on the rest of the society, in particular because of the measures that have been put in place to try to reduce the transmission. And finally, it's to facilitate the control of this disease in the medium and long term, because we know now that it will be extremely difficult to eradicate this virus. It's a different virus from the SARS-CoV.
難しいわけですよね。SARS とは違う。
And this new virus, SARS-CoV-2, is quite different, and its transmission also it's much higher than the previous one. And so it has been possible in 2003 to eliminate SARS, but now with COVID-19, it's much more challenging, and we see that many countries are really struggling with sustained community transmission. So first step of this partnership was really to define the overarching principles for ensuring equitable access to health products in the context of COVID-19. So you see on the screen all those principles. I will just highlight 2 or 3 that are, in my opinion, quite important. The first one is the equity and fairness will be based on public health needs. And so this is really important. It means that we will try to allocate products to target public health needs. Which means reducing mortality or reducing morbidity. And this is really important because we could have chosen other type of objective like economic objectives or others, but really public health needs were at the center. And The second thing is that because it's an end-to-end process, we look also at the research. And so we will also focus on products that can be used everywhere in the world, and not only produce products that can be used in countries with very sophisticated health systems. And so product, for instance, that can be administered under tropical climatic conditions, for instance, products that don't require necessarily very complicated cold chain, etc. So this is the focus. Of course, because we have nothing, we will also consider products that might not be as easy to use, but in general, I mean, the target is really to have a product that are as easy as possible to use under any kind of settings and context. The second thing that is also extremely important is that we know that if we want to be fast and also to have many products in hand, we need to collaborate because no one has a solution to this pandemic. And so collaboration is absolutely critical. But we need to collaborate in a way that is we build trust and it's transparent as well, because we are not trying to have only a business or opening markets, but really to make sure that everyone on Earth can have access to those vaccines. So as I said, it's an end-to-end process, and it's very important because at each stage, whether it's in research, manufacturing, procurement, or delivery, we are facing a number of challenges. So in research, for instance, there have been hundreds of clinical trials carried out everywhere in the world. So it's enormous effort from the research community. That requires also huge funding because not only we want to do it the best way possible, but also it's done in different settings. So there is a lot of coordination around it as well, and a lot of scrutiny on data that are coming from very different places in the world. So this research effort is unprecedented, and this has allowed us to have only 10 months after the start of this pandemic, already many products in the pipeline. The manufacturing also is challenging because if we want to manufacture at scale, we need to manufacture product in billions. And so this is not a business as usual, of course. Especially because it's new products. So also the manufacturing sector had to scale up this capacity, and this takes time as well and effort. So this is somehow challenging. The procurement also is quite challenging because we will have different products coming from different places in the world and going to different countries in the world as well. So we need to make sure that this whole machinery is well organized and in a timely manner as well. And the delivery, of course, is also challenging because we will need in each country to have the policies to implement those products, but also the infrastructure and the capacities, not only in terms of cold chain and other capacities, but also the workforce to use those products. So all of this is a very complex process, and that's why we need even more to be all together because no one can do it alone. And we need also to be conscious that even if there are obstacles, nothing is impossible, but sometimes it takes time, and we need to be as well cognizant of the time needed for each of these. And so that's why currently many partners are working tirelessly 24/7, trying to achieve those goals in a record time. So Act A is an integrated portfolio and is organized around 3 pillars: the vaccine, therapeutics, and diagnostic. For the vaccine, the goal is to reach 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. For the therapeutics, the goal is to have 245 million courses of treatment by mid-2021. And for diagnostic is 500 million tests by mid-2021. There is also what we call a health system connector, which is targeting to distribute PPE and oxygens to countries who have difficulties to access those items, but also is supporting a connection between vaccine, therapeutic, and diagnostics pillar, so that at country level also countries are ready to use those products. So when we started this long journey of Act A, there was really three options for countries to access those products. The first option was really bilateral agreement between one country and manufacturers. This is the path that has been chosen by certain countries, of course. The other options was really from some regions like the European Union, for instance, to join forces and to make deals with manufacturers at a regional level. And the third option was really to have a global approach. And the global approach was really the ambition of the Act A, because we wanted really to make sure that that was a reduction of risk by having a pool of countries dealing with, so a pool of demand dealing with a pool of supply, and also to make sure that there was more equitable access, because as you know, during those crisis periods, the risk is to see the prices going up very quickly, especially if the resource is scarce at the beginning. And so many countries would not have had access financially to those products. So it was really an attempt to mitigate the market effect and really to put solidarity at the forefront of these deals. So since the launch of Act A, we have seen a lot of progress. First, because vaccines, many products are in development. 10 products are in clinical trial phase 3, so really nearly to be licensed. And we have seen in the recent past Pfizer and Biotech, Moderna and AstraZeneca also make announcements at the end of their final phase 3 clinical trial. Pfizer and Moderna claim that they have more than 90% efficacy. So these are really good news. And AstraZeneca, so far, the efficacy is not yet completely confirmed because they have different results between the doses, 2 doses administration. But these are still very promising, and we're happy that we think that in the coming months we will be able to count on vaccines. And then we have also seen a lot of progress in therapeutics with dexamethasone, of course, that has been confirmed as a useful therapeutic treatment, but many more are still in clinical trials. And so we hope to have more good news in the recent future. Then we have also made a lot of progress in diagnostic, and we have an antigen-based rapid diagnostic test, and we are seeing much more progress in this area, and we hope to have more tests in the coming future as well. So this is very promising, but still requires a lot of investment. And so the total investment needed is $31.3 billion for the whole spectrum of ACT Accelerator. Of course, we try to convince countries that it's worth to invest in those products because we know that the cost of a pandemic in terms of lives lost, but also in terms of disruption in societies and economies will cost even more than this. So it's really a good investment for country. Investing in health is not a cost, it's really an investment. And it's good for the future of the population. But of course, it's always a bit difficult for countries to see this because everybody always expects that they will not have to pay a high price and they will get rid of this virus quicker than expected. So we are still in negotiation to make sure that this money can be given to accelerate even more the development of products. So let me talk briefly about the COVAX facility. So the COVAX facility is the mechanism that has been defined. It's a facility that has been defined for a vaccine only. It's a mechanism that has been open to self-financing country, meaning country who are really paying all the vaccine, and also funded country who will not pay entirely the vaccine, but it will be share cost, and it's known as advanced market commitment. COVAX was creating, considering the potential facilitate access by connecting a pool of demand to a pool of supply, and has the ambition, of course, to be completely global. And so far, I think 186 countries have shown interest in being a part of this COVAX. So it's a global procurement mechanism coordinated and legally administered by Gavi. And so COVAX will make investment across a broad portfolio of promising vaccines candidates, including some supported by CEPI, because CEPI is supporting the research part, and Gavi is really looking at the procurement part. So when COVAX was developed, we looked at a number of obstacles for equitable access or consideration. There is first a consideration of physical access. As it is a new disease, we have new vaccines as well. And so the development process is longer than for vaccines that are well known. And so we know that at the beginning, we will have very limited quantities, and even Pfizer, BioNTech, they estimate that they will have like about 20 million doses at the end of this year. So it's not much, and I think we will have this type of scenario also in the beginning of 2021 with limited quantities that will come bits and bits. And so we cannot count on a big stock at the beginning. Also, we need to also take into account that we will have different types of vaccine with different logistic requirements. Some vaccine require ultra cold chain. Some vaccine need a diluent. So there are a number of logistic things we need to take into consideration before the deployment and also the use of those vaccines. Then there is a consideration about the economic access. The price of those new vaccines are quite high for some of them, and so we need to find mechanism to make sure that everybody will have access financially to those vaccines, either through support, direct support to certain countries, or tier pricing, or donation, or we are looking at different modes to ensure that everybody has access. But the cost of the vaccine is only a part of this cost, because of course there are other considerations, ancillary items. We need also to look at operational costs for vaccination campaigns, and so all these costs have to be factored in, especially for low resource countries where they will have to. It's not enough to have a vaccine. You need to also vaccinate people, and this is more complicated than just having a vaccine. And then the access is also impacted by other considerations, such as regulatory and legal approval. There are issues about liability if there are adverse effects for these new vaccines. Certain vaccines will also be issued under a certain emergency consideration and use. And so we have really to look at all those things. And obviously, these are new vaccines. Even if the phase 3 trial seems to show that those vaccines are really safe, we will still need to carry out after vaccination surveillance, especially for potential adverse effects. And so we need also to set up those monitoring systems very early on. So how will those COVID products be allocated? We have first developed the overarching principle I showed you earlier on. Based on those principles, we have developed a global allocation framework. And then we have looked at mechanism to allocate those products. And the mechanism of the COVAX is the one for vaccine. We have not yet fully developed mechanism for therapeutics and diagnostics. And we are working on this with all the partners to see how we can rapidly finalize them. So when we were developing those framework, we had in mind a really clear process. We need first to develop the goals. What are the goals of this framework and allocation? What are the target groups? What is the timing? How are we going to allocate those scarce resources? And what are the boundary conditions? I mean, other conditions that we need to consider when we allocate those products. So the goal for the vaccine were clearly public health goals, and our aim was to really reduce mortality, reduce morbidity, of course, and protect the health system. So based on the other factors, we have decided that at the beginning, we will focus on reducing mortality and protect the health system are the main goals for the phase 1 allocation. The target group based on those objectives will be, of course, healthcare workers to protect the health systems, not only because they are needed to make sure that the health system still works, but also because healthcare workers are one of the at-risk group because they are extremely exposed to the virus. And we have noticed from some studies in October that an average of 14% of the cases are in healthcare workers, and many of them have lost lives since the beginning of the pandemic. But also to reduce mortality, we will also focus the vaccination on elderly and people with underlying condition, because these are the groups who are more at risk to have
にワクチンを投与していくということがとても重要ですし、またこの重症、
the timing, of course, is important. And for the vaccine, the phase 1 will allocate vaccine up to 20% of the population, which represent on average in the world the number of people that are either working in the health system or are belonging to the high-risk groups such as elderly and people with underlying
と
conditions.
か、もしくは基礎疾患を抱えた方がフェーズ1という形になります。そしてフェーズ2なんですが、残りのワクチンを
Vulnerability
その希弱性ですね。
of the pandemic at the time we have the vaccine. And the other condition we will look at will be the product characteristic, because of course, as I said, some vaccine product, for instance, require ultra cold chain, which is very hard to implement in certain low resource settings. And so we will try to allocate vaccines that are easier to use in those settings. And also the context of the countries, is the country has a capacity or not to implement, and how we can support them to implement vaccination. So we are also currently talking about a humanitarian buffer, and these are, being still defined. We don't have it yet, but we hope that it will be in place very soon. And why are we discussing this? It's because the COVAX is based on country. Country will participate to the COVAX. Country are really making submission to the COVAX. So it's a country-based things. Of course, we know that countries, and we will allow countries to distribute the product based on their needs, their own public health needs, even if we will make a recommendation on how to use those products, but ultimately, country will decide on how they want to use those products. But we realize that several populations might not be covered by this country mechanism. For instance, maybe migrants, or nomadic population, or refugees, might not be covered, especially at the beginning when the quantity of products are very scarce. And so we wanted to have a buffer that will allow us to cover those populations in case they are not covered by countries. Of course, we will encourage countries to take care of those populations, but in case it's not done, especially in war zone, we hope that we have the access to this buffer to cover those populations, because otherwise it could lead to an equity gap, and be based on the principle of solidarity and equity. We don't want this equity gap. So of course, most of the population will be covered by the regular mechanism, but we will have a buffer to cover those other population. Currently, the size of this buffer, the mechanism to allocate this buffer, everything is being discussed, and I cannot share with you any final characteristic of this buffer because it's still being discussed. What we know is that we will use as much as possible the existing mechanism to allocate those doses, and it will be done under the Interagency Standing Committee, who will really make sure that it's globally fair and equitable, and we will rely also on mechanisms that are in place for the implementation through the Global Health Cluster. But otherwise, beyond that, the rest is still being discussed, and I hope that very soon we can share with you more details on this. And this ends my presentation. I really thank you for your attention, and I hope I have covered most of your concern, and I'm happy to answer questions if any. Thank you very much.
ブリアン先生、どうもありがとうございました。この新型ウイルスの感染拡大に対して、医療に必要なシステムへのアクセスを促進するための活動としてのアクト A、そしてその中の3つのピラーとしてのワクチン、治療薬、診断薬、そしてその中でも特に重要なピラーの一つとして、ワクチンにおけるアクセスを提供する COVAX というものをご紹介いただきました。どうもありがとうございました。それでは次に、医薬品についてのアクセスですが、ここには薬の価格設定や知的財産権、公平の分配など、さまざまな問題が指摘されています。そこで、アクセスキャンペーンのウォン先生から、医薬品への公平なアクセスを実現するために、これから何が必要か、現状と課題について紹介し、国境なき医師団としての見解を説明してもらいます。なお、発表者の方にお願いですが、視聴者の方が見やすいように、できればフルスクリーンでお願いいたします。それでは、ウォン先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me on the panel. If you give me a second, I will try and share my screen. Okay. Is it coming on? Can everybody see this? Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to start. Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. My name is Sid Wong. I'm the Executive Co-Director for the Access campaign. I don't have so many slides, but what I wanted to do was just talk you through some of the key access challenges that we see in terms of COVID medical products. Small caveat is it's not a comprehensive presentation, so I'm going to pick a couple of the key ones just to present and hopefully then get into a discussion later on. Before I do that, and I don't know if everybody is so familiar with MSF's Access campaign, so let me just spend a couple of minutes just giving you a summary of who we are and what we do. So the MSF Access campaign was created in 1998, and we are part of the MSF family. Our work is very much rooted in our MSF medical operations and the context in which MSF works. But we are a specialized multidisciplinary team, and our focus is to tackle those systemic upstream barriers, whether these are technical, whether these are legal or whether these are political, that prevent equitable access to existing or novel medicines, medical tools, making them affordable, suitable, particularly for crisis-affected humanitarian populations. We do this through research, policy analysis, advocacy, lobbying, public communications, and at times campaigning. Some of our focus areas over the years have been around neglected diseases, predominantly HIV, TB, hepatitis C, vaccinations. And then what I've listed on my slide is some of those key common underlying systemic barriers that we have seen over the years. Whilst I think COVID-19 pandemic presents certainly some new challenges, we are certainly in unprecedented times. I think what we do see is that some of those underlying barriers, even for COVID-19 products, medical products, are some of these same underlying systemic barriers that we've seen affecting many of the other medical products over the years. So what are some of those systemic barriers? Intellectual property barriers, the incentives, the speed at which companies share knowledge, tech transfer, pricing and affordability, the limitations of our current sort of global research and development system, and whether or not it actually truly meets the needs of populations across the world. Clearly, again, for COVID-19 and particularly for vaccine supply and manufacturing capacity is an issue. And then also medical products that are suitable for the places where MSF works, particularly in low resource settings. So I'm going to touch upon some of these as I go through the presentation. So I think Sylvia in the last presentation also mentioned this, global solidarity. I think there is not a time, or at least for COVID pandemic, where there is an even greater need for governments, for researchers, scientists, pharmaceutical companies to collaborate, to share know-how, to share data. The first quote, global solidarity needed to find affordable, accessible COVID-19 vaccines. This was quoted by the Secretary General for the UN, Antonio Guterres, at the Global Vaccine Summit earlier on this year. That sentiment has also been expressed by many global leaders, many political leaders around the world. If I just take two political leaders, Germany's Angela Merkel and France's Emmanuel Macron, earlier on in the pandemic, they were very much supporting this notion that COVID-19 vaccines should be seen as a global public good that is accessible for all who need it around the world. And in terms of that global solidarity, we have seen some positive steps forwards. We have seen researchers, we have seen scientists that are willing and want to collaborate in developing some of these novel tools that we certainly need for COVID. We have what Sylvia was talking about, the COVAX mechanism. As it stands right now, this is the only mechanism that is trying to ensure that there is a global equitable allocation system for vaccines. The COVAX facility, I mean, it has ambitious aims. It wants to purchase 2 million doses by the end of 2021. And it's hoping to make sure that actually the 92 lower middle income countries will have access to these vaccines. And personally, for me, I think if we cannot make the COVAX AMC, which is the component that is going to procure and distribute these vaccines for low middle income countries, if we cannot make these fully functional, then I do think that will be a failure of our global pandemic response. But what we are seeing, unfortunately, is signs that are eroding this global solidarity. Vaccine nationalism. I think many of you have seen this in the news. The quote below by WHO's Executive Director Tedros very much is warning us against this. Oxfam a few months ago carried out some analysis. They did some research. They looked at the bilateral advance purchase deals that pharmaceutical corporations were already signing with countries for 5 of the leading vaccine candidates. And what their research shows is if you look at the current sort of first batch of production capacity, that over half over half of that capacity is already bought and secured through bilateral deals with a handful of developed countries. Clearly, there should be signs of optimism. And if we look at the COVID vaccines, the interim results for the first 3-4 leading vaccine candidates, they certainly look promising in terms of the efficacy data. The next step, moving from development to manufacturing, this is going to be a challenge. There are unprecedented volumes of vaccines that are clearly needed for the needs globally. And that will require rapid scale up of manufacturing capacity. And that manufacturing capacity has to be developed. What we can say, I think, or what we can assume is that certainly for 2021, we will have scarcity of vaccine supply in the short term. And then again, I think what's in Sylvia's presentation is what is even more important is that governments work together to ensure that there is fair and ethical allocation across the countries. Now, I think the WHO fair access and ethical allocation framework is a really good starting point, and that is something that I do feel that governments should be adhering to. I think what this framework allows is that all countries should have access to a share of the vaccines so that they can vaccinate the frontline healthcare workers and also priority high-risk groups, however they are defined or specific for their individual nations. And then Sylvie also mentioned that we should not forget about and we should not leave behind populations in crisis-affected humanitarian settings. These are marginalized populations, refugees, asylum seekers, people living in conflict. And these are populations who have the least access to, or at times excluded altogether from national healthcare services. So we are certainly very welcoming of the development of this humanitarian buffer. We as MSF have been trying to support WHO develop this, and we hope that this comes online relatively soon. And I think as we see the pipeline of vaccines and as we move towards sort of the next phase, as they become available, we should start to consider some of the other access barriers that we do see. Pricing and affordability. If we do truly see COVID vaccines as a global public good, then one could assume that they should be
負担できるぐらいのコストでこれが提供でされるようにしなければいけないわけです。モデルナのワクチン、それからアストラゼネカのワクチン。
Saying that this is at cost. What we can say is that in terms of these leading vaccines, a significant amount of public money has been invested into vaccine development. And I think governments need to demand transparency from these companies. I think in order for governments, for the public to hold these companies to account, they should be transparent about the costs of their R&D, their research and development, the cost of their production, prices that they're willing to sell this in countries, intellectual property status, licensing and technology transfer agreements. And again, I think one of the reasons for doing that is we can hold them to account and we can actually assess whether these are fair prices. Now, I think as we move from development of vaccine to manufacturing, and if we look at the enormous, the billions of doses that we would require over time, this will mean a huge and urgent upscale of manufacturing capacity. And some of that capacity certainly has to be developed. And for manufacturers, I think an extra challenge is that they are having to do this at risk. So before products are even receive regulatory approval, they're having to invest in increasing that manufacturing supply. I think if we look at some of the barriers to scaling up manufacturing capacity, I think no doubt one of the key things is knowledge sharing and tech transfer. That is absolutely key. That requires pharmaceutical companies, that requires global institutions to collaborate, to actually share that information. This is not an easy process. This is complex, it's time consuming. There are a number of steps and it requires large sort of teams of experts. And this is something that potentially takes quite a long period of time. And these are things that we need to start thinking now. How do we actually incentivize, push that actually that sharing starts to happen. There are some positives. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, they are being scaled up by multiple independent vaccine manufacturers globally. So for example, Serum Institute of India, but also a Brazilian company called Fiocruz. And right now, I think the vaccine has the highest projected production capacity worldwide out of the current vaccines that we have. And then moving on to intellectual property monopolies and barriers. I think over the years, we have seen exclusive rights, monopolies granted to pharmaceutical corporations, which have resulted in high prices and blocking generic competition. I think with control over the market, as a result of these patents or other exclusive rights, companies, they can determine how global production and supply chains are organized. They can determine who ultimately has access, who can produce these vaccines, and where they can be supplied. And I think furthermore, a lack of access to know-how, data, and IP can impact technology transfer and delay scale-up of more affordable generic and biosimilar products. And we have many examples of this. And let me just pick a few. In the past, high prices for patented medicines have certainly undermined the capacity of countries to provide access to treatments for HIV, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, and cancers. The role that intellectual property plays is not just isolated to drugs. I think we also see this with vaccines. So recent research over the last couple of years has shown that the availability of more affordable pneumococcal vaccines and the human papillomavirus for low middle income countries has certainly been delayed due to patents on key technologies blocking follow-up producers. To what degree patents are a barrier for vaccines? I think this is very much vaccine specific. Now, what you'll see on this slide is a landmark move from October of this year. So India and South Africa have asked the World Trade Organization to allow countries to choose neither to grant nor enforce patents and other intellectual property related to COVID-19 drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, and other technologies for the duration of the pandemic. So a couple of things maybe just to specify on this. So this is very much specifically for COVID-19. It does not suggest that it's waiving all of the TRIPS obligations, and it is certainly time bound. Now, I think this was discussed at the WHO TRIPS Council meeting on the 16th of October. And if this goes through, I mean, this is a landmark moment, I think, in terms of legal frameworks, in terms of governments having more control, having more ability to actually try themselves to break down the barriers of access for drugs, for medical products, for vaccines, for use in their own countries. This is a significant step. This is not only a significant step, I think, for this current pandemic, but I think looking forward into the future, this is also an important landmark. I do think something like this is going to provoke, it's going to push the world to think differently. It's going to challenge the current research and development system and really start to look at alternative R&D models that really serves the public health sort of benefits and objectives across the globe. And I think the next speaker is going to talk about DNDi. And DNDi is certainly an alternative model that tries to demonstrate that actually we can do things differently and the impact can be better. This is my last slide, but I'm just going to talk you through this. So during the session in October at the WTO TRIPS Council meeting, the waiver was very much supported. So it was supported by Kenya, Eswatini, who became the official co-sponsors of the proposal with South Africa and India. And right now, nearly 100 countries are very much welcomed and support this waiver. Unfortunately, 9 WTO members, including the EU, have not supported this proposal yet. This has certainly garnered a lot of support in the civil society, and multiple intergovernmental organizations are lending the support, including MSF. Right now, I think over 300 civil society organizations globally have been calling for governments to support this proposal. In terms of where this will go, in December, this will be discussed at the General Council of the WTO. I'm hoping at that time we can actually garner more support for this. It's inevitable that negotiations will proceed into 2021 and possibly until June at the ministerial conference at the WTO. So, like I said, my presentation certainly by no means is comprehensive, but it's really trying to pull out some of the key access challenges that we see that are affecting COVID-19 medical products. It's a snapshot, it's very macro, and some of these access challenges are very much upstream. So thank you very much for letting me present, and happy to take questions.
ウォン先生、ありがとうございました。アクセスキャンペーンからは、価格やインフラのせいで薬にアクセスできない人たちがいるという観点から問題定義をいただき、また、新型コロナウイルスに関する薬剤やシステムは国際的な公共財、グローバルパブリックグッズであるという考えから、広く人々に行き渡る必要があるということでした。COVAX においても必要なワクチン量が非常に膨大であり、しかも時間的な問題もある点から、製造のための大きなキャパシティが重要で、ここに特許権の行使に関しても再度考慮し直す必要があるのかもしれません。そこで WTO においてインドと南アフリカからは、トリップス協定の一時的破棄が要請されたということですが、MSF もこれに同意し、活動していく必要があるということでした。ウォン先生、どうもありがとうございました。それでは最後に DNDi Japan の中谷代表にお願いいたします。アクセスの問題に取り組むもう一つの鍵は、メディカルイノベーション、すなわち医薬品の研究開発です。ここでは、アンチコブのような新しい研究開発を含めた新たな共同モデルが存在しています。こうした点から DNDi の取り組みについて、中谷さんからお話をいただきます。それでは中谷さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。本日このような機会をいただきまして、非常にありがたく、感じております。では、画面を共有させていただきます。共有されておりますでしょうか。
申し訳ありません。まだ共有されてないようですね。
なぜか、テクニカルプログラムが出てしまって、そちらにお送りしてあるのですが、そちらで投影していただくということは可能でしょうか。なぜか、すいません。
それでは中谷先生、こちらの方でスライドを投影いたしますので、少しお待ちください。
失礼いたしました。はい、ありがとうございます。今回私どもと非常に特別な関係のあるMSF さんからこういう機会いただきまして本当にありがたく思っております。次お願いします。MSF キャンペーンさんと同じでですね、私どもも少し簡単に成り立ちを紹介させてください。20年ほど前にですね、患者さんが貧しいということで、なかなか薬の研究開発は進まずに、治療ができないという現場の状況がございました。で、当時ですね、顧みられない薬、病気のために開発される薬というのは 1% と言われておりました。で、例えば、お話ありましたけれども、アフリカ、 ですね、アフリカ睡眠病ではですね、医薬品の副作用により当時20人に1人の患者さんが亡くなっていたような状況です。そしてMSF さんが国境なき医師団さんがノーベル平和賞を取ったときに、その賞金の一部をですね、新しい非営利の革新的な医薬品開発を推進するために充てたと。それでできたのが DNDi でございます。そして今回こういう機会いただいて非常にありがたく思っております。以後17年にわたりまして、我々は数百万もの化合物を探索して、そこから安全で安い安価な薬を作るべく努力をしてまいりました。次お願いします。では、先ほど前の方が少しご紹介いただいたんですが、じゃあ革新的な研究開発のモデルとは何なのかということなんですけれども、経済レベルとか、どこに住んでいるかにかかわらず、薬を必要としている方に届けるためにですね、DNDi が調整役となって、公的機関や民間企業、政府会社の方々、それから大学、非営利団体、財団など皆さんパートナーと一緒になってですね、研究開発の情報を共有しつつ、研究開発、安全な薬を目指してですね、有望な候補薬を選んで、低中所得国などで臨床試験を実施をしております。また先ほどありましたが、知的財産権につきましても、患者さんの利益を最優先に、権利が障害にならないように関係者と交渉を行っております。で、今まで、8つの治療法と、20を超える候補薬を発掘してまいりました。次お願いします。で、私ども8つの事務所を持ちまして、200以上の研究機関のパートナーの皆さんと世界中で、お仕事をさせていただいております。次お願いします。で、ご存知の方もいるかと思うんですけれども、薬剤の研究開発ですが、多くのステップを必要とする。
R&D needs a lot of the steps we needed to
臨床開発、薬を使用する国における登録、薬を届けるため
necessary, and also we needed to the assessment of the candidates and the registry.
ステップを踏みます。これを一つの組織が行うのではなくてですね、多くのパートナーさんと行うことで、いかに早く、そして安く安全な薬を届けるかというところでございます。次お願いします。で、私どもアカデミア、大学の皆さん、それから製薬会社の皆さん、それから新しいところでは AI を使った創薬ということで、いろんな企業さんと、お仕事をさせていただいており、日本ではですね、G-HIT ファンドさんのご支援をいただいて、さまざまな活動を行っております。次お願いします。で、研究開発なんですけれども、その病気が発生している現場近くで行い、そしてその病気にある国の研究者の能力開発ということも行っておりまして、そうすることで将来の研究開発を低所得国で行っていけるような取り組みも行っております。はい、次お願いします。で、ただですね、残念ながら、20年前の課題が解消されたかというと、実は同じ課題が残っております。例えば、何を研究開発の焦点に据えるのか、優先順位付けに必ずしも低中所得国のアイデアが反映されることがなかなかない。また、患者さんの、もうお話出ておりますけれども、その患者さんのニーズがなかなか優先されるということも難しい。市場原理との関係でですね。で、新しい技術、コロナも同じですけれども、なかなか直接平等なアクセスに、直結しないというようなことがあります。で、このあたりはですね、今回のコロナ対策でも同じようなことがありますので、DNDi のコロナ採択と絡めてですね、ご説明できればというふうに思っております。次、お願いします。先ほど来、お話がございましたけれども、アクトアクセスレーターが設立されまして、検査、治療、予防、そして、ヘルスシステムのピラーで、動いております。DNDi としては、専門家委員として、招聘されて、ピラーの、治療の方に関わっておりますけれども、例えば、そこではですね、低所得国の研究者は、例えば参加をしていないというふうに聞いてます。ですから、新しい技術の開発を選択するときにですね、我々は無意識のうちにですね、先進国のために 便利というか良い技術というものを、結果として選定していることになっているのかもしれません。例えば先ほども出てきましたけれども、新しい薬の開発、最近非常にモノクロナル抗体等々もお話しされておりますけれども、非常に値段が高い。じゃあこれどうやってその低中所得国のニーズに今後合致させていくのかということ、非常に大きな課題であるというふうに思っております。低中所得国の研究者が意思決定に関わる技術を、どの技術を選んでいくのかという決定に関わったり、まずあと利用しやすいものを開発していくということに関して非常に必要性が求められていると思っています。で、先ほど来ワクチンの話が出ておりますけれども、薬も同じでですね、電気などのインフラやサプライチェーンが脆弱な地域で治療薬を保管して供給するためにどうしていくのか、そのためにどういったその技術が必要かという議論がなかなか必ずしもまだなされていないと、早い段階なのかもしれませんが、というふうに感じております。また流通製造、そういったことの技術革新であるとか、キャパシティビルディング、途上国のなど、なかなかアクセスの拡大にはいろいろと、考えなければいけない課題があって、その辺をですね、先ほど来パートナーシップというお話がたくさん行われておりましたけれども、やはり知見と経験を共有して結集してですね、我々やはり新しい技術の開発というものを進めていくべきではないでしょうかと思っております。で、我々じゃあDNDiとしてですね、今までの知見経験を踏まえて、じゃあどういうことができるのかと考えたときに、やはり低中所得国でどう治療を支援していくのかということではないかと思いましてですね、3つ考えました。1つ目が今皆さん見ていただいているパワーポイントですけれども、中小国の COVID 関係の研究を加速するために我々がどう支援するかということ、それから治療を特定する臨床試験を実施すること。で、3つ目としてですね、将来期待される化合物の探索と3つの観点から取り組むということにしております。で、このスライドですけれども、低中所得国で行われている研究を迅速に促進するグループを作りましてですね、それで情報共有、例えばプロトコールの共有ですとか、患者さん、臨床試験に入っていただく患者さんへのクエスチョナーを共有するですとか、情報の共有を促進して、また世界中のいろんなところで行われている先進している研究の知見を集約して共有する。それから各分野ワーキングブロックを作りましてですね、そこで研究を全体として支援をするということを行っております。次お願いします。で、2番目なんですけれども、これ臨床試験ですが、アフリカの13カ国と国際的な研究機関のネットワークの協力のもと、軽症、中等症の外来患者さんを対象にしたアフリカで最大規模の臨床試験を開始をしております。で、これはですね、もう皆さん、人道支援をやっている方であればよく状況をご存知だと思うんですけれども、そもそもアフリカの保健システムは非常に脆弱です。そこに多くの負荷をかけない、これ以上の負荷をかけないようにですね、入院患者さんの急増を防ぐとともに、軽症、中等症の患者さんの早期治療に有効な治療法を特定することを目的としております。で、アフリカおよび世界の26の研究機関からなるコンソーシアムによって13カ国19施設で実施されて、我々は調整役を担っております。で、どうやってるかということなんですけれども、がんの治療開発で先駆けとなりましたアダプティブプラットフォームというやり方をですね採用いたしまして、非常に柔軟な体制で、例えば複数の異なる治療薬が同時に評価したりですね、あと結果が出たときに継続的な分析をしながら治療群の追加や継続停止などを柔軟に決断をして早く決定していくというような方法でやっております。 で、私どもはですね、独自でこれをやっているのではなくてですね、ユニットエイドさん、それからウェルカムさんが、共同で取りまとめももちろん行っている、先ほどから出ておりますけれども、ACTA と協力、治療パートナーと協力しましてですね、有効性の証明とともに、最も有望な治療薬を選択するために、非常に連携してやっているというところでございます。で、じゃあ何をする、どんな薬をというところなんですけれども、まずですね、多くのアフリカ諸国で現在、COVID-19 の標準治療薬となっている、抗 HIV レトロウイルスの薬の配合剤である、ロピナビル、リトナビル、それから抗マラリア薬であるヒドロキシクロロキンについて、対象群、これパラセトモールになりますけれども、比較試験に着手をまずします。そして、その後でさまざまな候補薬を足していくということになります。で、先ほど来情報の共有という話出ておりますけれども、これはですね、すべての臨床試験のデータは統合されまして、公衆衛生施策の活用のために透明性広く公開されてまいります。そして私どもこのアンティオブコンソーシアムはですね、ドイツ連邦教育研究所およびACTA の一環としてユニットエイド様から提供されており、非常に感謝申し上げております。で、最後のスライドお願いします。またですね、最後の活動なんですけれども、DNDi としては今までの知見を生かしまして、COVID 関連知見のための化合物の探索を行っております。短期的には化合物のデータを集積して評価して、そのうち効果の予想されるものを優先順位付けしながら検証を行っています。中長期的には抗ウイルス活性のみではなくて、感染によって発生する臓器ごとに異なる影響などを人間に近い形で再現することができる評価系、例えば感染モデル動物の確率などが待たれています。また右の部分ですけれども、長期的には関係者の方はご存知ですけれども、ウイルスには感染を広げるに関して避けては通れないプロセスというのがいくつかあって、それらのプロセスをいかに妨害して薬剤開発をするかということになってくるんですけれども、例えばその一つが細胞に侵入する際の経路、もう一つは感染した人の細胞内で自分のウイルスの遺伝子を複製する過程となるんですけれども、その2つの過程を妨害する既存の薬剤について、薬剤の化学構造を変えることによってコロナウイルスにも効果を持たせることができないか、今検討を行っています。ですので、我々この3つの方策でいろんな努力を重ねております。で、最後にやはり今非常にワクチンにさまざまな投資、また目が向いておりますけれども、どんなディジーズ対策におきましてもワクチン、そして治療、検査ということはパッケージでございまして、何が欠けてもうまくいかないということで、やはりその全体を見たさまざまなバランスの取れたフレームワークの構築として実施ということをやっていかなければいけないのではないかというふうに思っております。今回はありがとうございました。以上です。
中谷先生、ありがとうございました。アクト A の中でも DNDi が調整役となって研究開発の情報共有をしつつ、グローバルな専門知識を活用してインパクトのある新型コロナウイルス研究を実現し、このような知識、データを共有することによって、低中所得国における観点からも診断治療への平等で手頃なアクセスを支持する活動を行っているということでした。その中ではアンティコブコンソーシアムというものが軽症・中等症に対する早期治療を促進することで感染拡大を防ぎ、病院への負担をかけないようにするという活動も行っているということでした。また、新たな観点からの治療薬の開発にも取り組んでみえるということでした。ありがとうございました。パネリストの皆様には、それぞれ非常に最新の大変貴重なお話をいただき、ありがとうございました。この新型コロナウイルスに対しては、国際社会が協調し、連携して取り組んでいくために何が必要か、それぞれの観点からさまざまなご指摘をいただきました。 そしてそのためにはまず各国政府が自国中心主義を超えてこのパンデミックの危機を共同して乗り越えていくことが重要であることが示されました。こういった状況について我々国境なき医師団も日本の社会各方面に伝えていきたいと考えています。ところで日本政府は先週末に開催された G20 サミットにおいて菅総理大臣がスピーチで述べられたように新型コロナウイルス感染症に対するアクト多国間協力の重要性を強調し、人間の安全保障や UHC ユニバーサルヘルスカバレッジの観点から国際的な取り組みを牽引する意思表明をしています。ワクチンに関しては製薬会社との直接取引で国内において使用するワクチンを確保しつつ、COVAX ファシリティに参加し、COVAX AMC を通じて途上国支援にも協力することを表明しました。ワクチン開発をはじめとする薬剤開発においては、ワクチン外交などと言われ、今も国際社会では薬物治療開発の状況は刻々と変化していますが、それではブリアン先生とウォン先生に伺いたいと思います。もうすでに発表の中でも触れられていたかと思いますが、今、日本政府をはじめとする各国政府に求められる行動として、一体何が最も重要なことであると思われるでしょうか。ブリアン先生、ウォン先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Can you repeat the question, please? Because with the translation, I'm not sure I've captured the question. Sorry.
はい。今、日本政府をはじめとする各国政府に求められる行動として、どのようなことが最も重要だと思われますでしょうか。
You want me to start or you, Sydney wants? Okay.
はい、どうぞ。
You can start.
ブリアン先生、よろしくお願いします。
So if you allow me, I would like to give maybe a broader picture so that we can understand where we stand currently. I think we are in a pandemic, which means that everybody is affected. And so it makes absolute sense to find a solution together. So because no one is safe until everyone is safe. And we know that if the virus continues to circulate in some countries, it will reinfect other countries after some time. So this perspective is really a public health perspective, basically. And so, but on the other hand, to tackle this health problem, we need products. And those products are produced by private companies. And so private companies are in have a certain business model in, I would say, in peacetime, I mean, outside pandemic. And so if you apply this business model during a pandemic, it's a the pandemic is a very special situation because we do have very high needs, very high demand, and very scarce resources. So normally, in a normal world, outside pandemic, when you have this kind of situation, and with this kind of business model, you will have very high price, no transparency, and this is the, I would say, the economic perspective. So of course, everyone would like that during a pandemic, we have other business model, and we need to develop other business models so that the public health perspective can be valued and also the public health goals can be achieved. But changing business model takes a lot of time. And I think Kaori has mentioned DNDi, so we do have different attempts to modify the business model so that it can apply for pandemic, but it takes time. And so currently there are the COVAX and the Act A is one of these attempts to try to mitigate the effect of a normal business model. But of course, we need to develop probably other initiatives to overcome the business model that is normally in place in any, I mean, in the current economic model that is in place in the world. And so it's probably ACT Accelerator will address certain issues, and we hope so. And with the AMC country, for instance, we hope that we can address access situation, but the ACT Accelerator is not changing completely the business model. It's still trying to bring together a number of stakeholders so that we can, within the current business model, have more access for a low and middle resource countries. But it's not completely changing the business model. And so within the Act A, we will also value donation and other mechanisms that have been put in place in the past and has worked for addressing the equity gap. But obviously, it's not a complete change in business model as we may want to see for pandemic time. And so I think there was one question in the chat also about CTAP. I think CTAP is another mechanism that is being developed to propose new ways of doing business during pandemic times. We had in the past also our member state adopted the pandemic influenza preparedness framework with also an attempt to propose a different business model for pandemic situation. So there are initiatives and they are very good also successes and results for certain initiative. I think it's time also to look at things with a broader picture to see what kind of initiative could be activated or accelerated during this particular pandemic so that we maybe are even faster in developing a model that could really satisfy public health needs during pandemic situation. And so for member states, I mean, we are working with them very closely to see with them if we can first increase the mechanism that have been working in the past, like donation, like tier pricing, like other mechanism, because it's still good. We don't want to, I mean, get rid of those mechanisms. It's not optimal. But that's still, at least, I mean, if we can ensure access to a number of groups and population that are in need in the world, I think it would be already a success. But of course, it's never sufficient. So we need to continue working on additional mechanism that will allow us during this pandemic, if possible, but at least for the next pandemic, to have a more equitable framework to tackle public health needs during pandemics.
ブリアン先生、ありがとうございました。つまり各国とも一国の問題ではなく、国際協力という、公衆衛生の観点から、物事を進めていく必要があるということでよろしいでしょうかね。ありがとうございました。それではウォン先生、お願いいたします。
Yeah, I think just building on from what Sylvie was saying, I'll probably add in there with sort of 4 concrete points. I mean, I think if we consider that for equitable allocation of COVID vaccines, the COVAX and particularly the AMC, which is the mechanism that is going to ensure that low and middle income countries receive the vaccines, governments have to ensure that that is funded, and governments have to ensure that that is fully functional and is part of our overall global response to beat the pandemic. Secondly, I think governments to support the development of the humanitarian buffer that WHO are developing and leading on. Right now, it's uncertain actually where the vaccines are going to come from to supply the humanitarian buffer. And we do need a sustainable supply within that humanitarian buffer. So that would be my second point. I think my third point is certainly for 2021, when we know and when we can assume that the vaccines are going to be scarce, I think governments, whilst it's very understandable that they are going to prioritize and secure doses for their own countries and sort of national needs, but that should not undermine or damage sort of global collective efforts. So governments should be adhering to the WHO global allocation framework so that we can at least ensure that all countries who prioritize COVID, who need it, who need the vaccines, to ensure that at least they can vaccinate their frontline healthcare workers and priority high-risk groups. And then two last points. One, my fourth point is, I think I was talking earlier about governments should demand, hold accountable companies to be more transparent with their costs in terms of R&D, in terms of development, so we can have a better assessment in terms of the pricing that they are proposing, but also transparency in the agreements that they're signing with countries. And I think there was a question from Clara in the chat. I mean, how much are we aware of the access conditions that are written into these agreements? Unfortunately, we're not aware of some of these because many of these agreements are secret. So we don't know is actually the answer to some of this. And then I think my final point is, and in the last slides that I presented, we should be asking governments to fully be supporting the WTO waiver, which is being proposed by South Africa and India, actually passes through the WTO next year.
ありがとうございました。やはり、日本といたしましても単に資金供給をするだけでなく、さまざまな問題、人道援助バッファーであったり、そういったことに対しても積極的に意見を述べていく必要があるのかなというふうに感じました。ありがとうございました。それでは、次に、特に日本においてですが、日本の医療技術がこのような感染対策に果たす役割もかなり期待されるのではないかと思われますが、この点について中谷さん、どう思われますでしょうか。
はい、ありがとうございます。例えば日本の企業さんとの関係でいうと、富士フィルムさん、が非常にこの分野で、海外ではですね頑張っておられますけれども、日本でもいろいろな取り組みが行われていると思うんですが、同時に日本の日本の中での開発、と日本の外での開発ということで、そこにディバイドというかがあるような気がしてならないんですよね。日本の場合はそこが日本の中での動きが、海外での動きにどうリンクしていくのかっていうのが、一つ研究開発の分野では一つ大きな課題なのかなというふうに考えています。そして、何か我々がカタリストとしてですね、何かできればという観点もございます。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。やはり国際協力という立場からいろんな物事を進めていくべきでないかということでしょうか。それではそろそろ、そうですね、質問者からの参加者の皆様からの質問に移りたいと思います。まずは、ブリアンさんへの質問ですね。ワクチンが国単位での取得、そしてバッファーは国単位では届けられない人々への分という理解をしました。その理解が正しければ、例えばパレスチナ自治区のような国際的に国として認められないような地域の場合に、どうなりますか。バッファーでのカバーでしょうか。国として取得ができるのでしょうかということですが、ブリアンさん、いかがでしょうか。
Yes, this humanitarian buffer was really an attempt to cover population who could not otherwise have access. When we call them non-state-based population, basically, because the COVAX, as I said, is a facility based on countries' contribution and participation. So certain population don't belong to a country necessarily. And so that's why the buffer was created to address those needs. But if we want this buffer to be really equitable, what is really important is that it should be a real-time sharing, meaning that every time you have certain amount of vaccine, a proportion of them, a few percent of this amount should be set aside and distributed in real time also to those populations. So it's a fairly complex mechanism, and this is why it takes a lot of time to set up this humanitarian buffer.
はい、ありがとうございました。それでは次の質問です。これもブリアンさんへの質問ですが、WHO はコスタリカ政府提案の CTAP も承認したと認識しています。とても良いプロポーザルだと思いますが、CTAP の進捗状況を教えてくださいということですが、ブリアンさん、いかがでしょうか。
Yes, CTAP was indeed an attempt from certain member states, and they proposed it to the other member state, WHO member states, to consider this proposal was on the voluntary sharing of health technology related knowledge, intellectual properties and data related to COVID product. And CTAP was really trying to leverage existing mechanisms such as medicine patent pools or other type of mechanisms that are already in place, and really with voluntarily with other countries volunteered to contribute to this. So CTAP indeed was a very interesting proposal. It's still being discussed between member states, and some member states are really advancing the discussions. But it's going on parallel with the Act A. And currently, I mean, there is no necessarily convergence of those two streams, but both streams are going in parallel. Let's say that the Act A is probably the fast solution and a pragmatic one in the given context, while CTAP is also a very important aspect of it, but it's ongoing and will take maybe more time. So probably one of important thing is to have a good overview of all those initiatives and make sure that they synergize as much as possible and as rapidly as possible as well. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。続いてまたブリアンさんへの質問ですが、セーブ・ザ・チルドレンの堀江様からです。多くの国が2国間のワクチン協定に多額の資金を投入しており、かつ経済的困難に立ち向かっている中、アクト A が直面しているファンディングギャップは現実的に埋めることができるというふうにお考えでしょうか。
Okay, but I think yeah, we are trying to put in place mechanisms that are more fair and equitable, and of course, I mean, usually during crisis there is a kind of movement from rich country donating to low and middle income countries. I think many people feel that this model has to evolve with this pandemic for many reasons, because obviously the capacities of rich countries may decrease with this pandemic, and so this has to be taken into account as well. And there are also different polarities, I would say, in the world vis-a-vis those Act A products. So my feeling is that this pandemic is really an evolving phenomenon. There have been a lot of surprises so far. For instance, that there have been limited impact on health, at least in Africa so far. And so this has to be considered as well in the way we will define the new model. And we need to see how we can, having in mind public health need, also making sure that we keep this in the objective of the distribution as well. And so I'm sure that many producing countries are also looking at that as well. I mean, probably the users of the vaccine will be much more in rich countries as well, just because currently they are much more affected. So this is one important point, the dynamic of the pandemic in the way you will look at the distribution and so on. The second important point is that the vaccine is so far only an additional tool in the toolbox. And it will remain the same for a few months still, because first we won't have a lot of vaccine. Those vaccines will be really new products, so we will still need to look at the safety and the efficacy. And so I think for the coming months, we will still need to have a really open discussion on tools we have in hand. And so it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to look at the business models we would like to have in place, but there are also very important discussions we need to have about how to use those tools, what would be the best way to maximize the impact of a vaccine or a treatment. And so that's why I think we cannot reduce the debate on the business model currently. We have also to incorporate a lot of discussion on the public health approach we would like to have, because and it's a very specific period. Maybe the debate on public health will change completely when we have in hand a lot of vaccine, and then we move to a completely different phase of the pandemic. But for the time being, I think both discussions are really important to put on the table, and we cannot have only a discussion on the economic aspect. We need also to integrate a very open discussion on the public health aspect. And I think it's particularly important because we cannot be obsessed by the higher technologies and so on. We have also to consider repurposing, for instance, of certain drugs or approaches. And I'm sure that Kaori can talk more about it. We have currently focusing on the research on treatment, for instance, for hospitalized patients. But we need also to look at treatment for people outpatient. This is very important because if we can prevent people from going to hospital, it's also a major public health achievement. And we should continue to have those discussions and making sure that the public health objective remain at the center, while of course economic consideration should be taken into account, but not to the detriment of public health objectives. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。それでは次にですね、アクセスキャンペーンのウォン先生への質問ということですが、WTO の一部の加盟国がインドと南アフリカのトリプスに対する提案に消極的な理由は何でしょうか。COVID-19 ワクチンを公共財にするメリットより、自国の製薬会社の知的財産権を守ることを優先しているのでしょうか。 日本も反対している国の一つということなのですが、今日日本からの参加者に伝えたいメッセージはありますでしょうか。
Yeah, it's a good question. So for the countries that currently are opposing or are not supporting the waiver, what are the reasons for that? What are their opposing reasons? And there's a few that I can list for you today. I think the first one is that there are still many who feel that intellectual property is an important incentive. They think it's an incentive to enable medical innovation. There are some that believe that there is no indication of how intellectual property rights is a barrier for sort of current COVID-19 related medicines. We would refute that. We see clearly, and we do have examples where intellectual property has had an effect on current sort of COVID medical tools, but also previous examples from other diseases. I think some opponents are saying that the current voluntary mechanisms that we have in place are effective, so why should we not be using them? For example, things like voluntary licensing and technology transfer of companies. What we do see, and analysis that we've done in the Access campaign, is that there are clear limitations to the application of the use of voluntary licensing. There's also, and again, it's been mentioned before, the creation of, again, voluntary mechanisms like the WHO CTAP. But as far as I believe, I think there has been resistance. I don't know how many companies are using that, but again, that I think there still is a reluctance to even use these voluntary mechanisms. So ensuring that collaboration happens using voluntary mechanisms, there are clear limitations. Now, some also argue that within the TRIPS agreement, you have these flexibilities. For example, the use of compulsory licensing. But many countries, many developing countries, and what we are aware of is that they struggle to actually use these measures. There are so many stringent provisions within the TRIPS agreements that make it very difficult for developing countries to actually enact these, even if they wanted to. And we also hear that actually from the pressures that other countries, particularly developed countries, apply to developing countries in when they choose or when they want to use compulsory licensing. So these are kind of some of the arguments that some of these opposing countries are putting on the table.
ありがとうございました。それではもう一つですね、ウォン先生への質問ですが、公的資金を受けている製薬会社はワクチンの正当なコストを保証するためにも R&D や生産コストに関する情報開示をする必要があると考えます。これらの公的資金は国家政府もしくは国際機関、国際的ファンドプール提供のものに限られているのでしょうか。もしそうである場合、ワクチンへのアクセス、適正価格条件は設けられていないのでしょうかということですが。
Yeah, I think I tried to quickly answer that question in my last sort of response earlier on to Clara. I mean, I think two things here, right? I think in general, we want more transparency from companies themselves, just in terms of their cost of goods, in terms of how much it costs for research and development and manufacturing. So, and then secondly, in terms of access conditions that are written into these agreements, one of the challenges that we face is many of these agreements are done in secrecy, so they are not shared. We have been trying to access some of them, so it is not so clear for us what some of those access conditions would actually be or look like in these agreements. And again, I think that is one of the issues. Governments should be pushing on companies to actually, again, make transparent what is included in these agreements.
はい、ありがとうございました。それでは今、質問がちょっと途切れているようですので、それでは、私の方から少しご質問させていただきたいと思いますが、その人道的バッファーについて、なんですけども、これに関してはまだまだフレームが決定されていないというふうなことのようですが、これに関しては今後どのような形で決定がされていくのか、あるいはその決定に際してどのような介入があるべきなのかといった点について、どの先生でも結構ですのでお答えいただけますでしょうか。じゃあブリアン先生よろしくお願いします。
Yeah, thanks. I think what is important is to understand, I have talked about the difficulty, the consideration for access. And I think, so the idea of having a humanitarian buffer is somehow accepted. Even Gavi is putting this to the board very soon. Because the COVAX is under Gavi administration, so Gavi needs the authorization of the board for this humanitarian buffer. So I think the principle is accepted. What is really difficult now is to develop the mechanism, because there are significant difficulties. One of the difficulties is, for instance, in countries where you have part of the countries with refugee camps, for instance, and the countries, so what we would like is each country who is part of the COVAX takes also care of the refugees. But it's likely if the country has only 20% of its population covered, that they will not prioritize necessarily the refugee camp. And so what we wouldn't like to have is a kind of preference from the international community to the refugee camps, while the other population of the country is not served or is not covered either. So we don't want to create inequities within a given country. And that's why we need also to make a humanitarian buffer that is really equitable for all the population on a given territory. And so this is one aspect that we would like to ensure that countries also take care of those populations that are not necessarily considered initially as a priority. The second thing is really we have, because as I said, what is important with this humanitarian buffer is that it's real time. Because in previous crises, we have seen that at the end of the pandemic, those populations will receive vaccine, but after everybody. So what we would like to ensure is that it's real time. They have it at the same time as the other, but the quantity will be very small at the beginning. Let's imagine that you have 20 million doses, or I mean, here I'm very optimistic. Let's imagine that you have 1 million doses available at the beginning of 2021, and if you take 2% of this, it's really a small amount of doses. So how do you distribute this and expect to have a meaningful public health impact? And so there are some technical consideration also for this distribution. And imagine that the first vaccine to come out and to be available is the vaccine that requires ultra cold chain, for instance. How are we going to distribute this vaccine in settings where you have refugee population? And maybe we will spend a lot of money to distribute this vaccine, while probably there are other interventions that are more efficient. like I don't know, providing PPEs or providing oxygens or maybe more diagnostic tests or you know, or even food, so that people at least have a better immune system because they are better nourished. So we cannot see this only through the angle of the product itself. We have to have a comprehensive view and really question ourselves. What would be better for those populations to tackle COVID-19 outbreak and make sure that they have access to these other tools? So that's why also the humanitarian buffer, the discussion currently is very much focused on vaccine because we are discussing with Gavi. But what we would like to have is a buffer that is not only for vaccine, it's also for therapeutics and also for diagnostics and maybe other items such as PPE and also oxygens, ventilators, really making sure that the health of those population is protected and not only that they get vaccinated. Thank you.
ブリアン先生、ありがとうございました。それでは私の方からもう一つ質問です。中谷先生にお願いしたいんですが、アンティコブコンソーシアムというものには、臨床研究の経験が認められた、26の研究機関が参加しているということで、この適用設計によって、試験の妥当性であるとか、完全性を損なうことなく、試験自体に蓄積されたデータに基づいて、試験群を追加または削除することができるというふうな、ことが言われているようですが、一方でですね、実際アフリカの国々の人たちにおいては、こういった臨床研究、治験というものが、先進国のために、こういった国々の人を、悪い言葉かもしれませんけども、実験台にしているのではないかというような、意見も、散見されるようです。こういった点について、そのアンティコブコンソーシアムの妥当性というかですね、そのあたりがどのように担保されているかといった点についてお聞きしたいと思います。
ありがとうございます。この問題はですね、我々なんでこのトライアルをやっているかというと、やはりアフリカのニーズがやはりに合った研究開発が行われていないと。遺伝的にも違うかもしれませんし、また先ほどリパーパスというお話がありましたけれども、要はですね、すでに承認されて登録されている薬を別のものに使えるとかですね、そういうことがやはりですね、なかなか今もうワクチンがまだできていない段階で、またワクチンができたとしても安全性が担保されていない段階で必ず治療薬が必要になると。ただし、新しい治療薬がアフリカまで、例えば他の国でもそうですけど、到達するまでもっと時間かかると。その中で今ある安全性が担保されているお薬、そして医療従事者がすでに使っているもの、そして安全性も担保されているものが、COVID のある、患者さんのある症状に使えるかどうか。ということをやはり確定していくことが必要だと思います。例えばハイドロキシクロロキンについては、例えば16カ国アフリカの、現地でですね、標準治療薬、スタンダードオブケアとして今使われています。で、それが効果が科学的なしっかりとした大規模な調査がなくですね、行われて使われていると。それでいいのかということですよね。やはり科学的にしっかりと担保をした上で、標準薬として使うということですので、我々がやろうとしていることはですね、やはり現地のニーズに合った形でいかに安全性の担保された形で、また倫理面でも皆さんご心配されていると思いますが、WHO のご支援で、やられている、アフリカ地域のアブレフという組織を使ってですね、きちんと倫理面も、このアンティコブしっかりと非常に厳しいスタンダードでやっております。 で、また非常に13カ国ということで数も多いですので、かなりこういう今週、発表させていただいたんですが、かなりこの調整に時間かかっております。それはなぜかというと、やはりですね、きちんとしたやり方でやると、世界的に認められているやり方で質を担保し、そして倫理面もきちんと担保していくということを、アフリカだからということは許されません。我々、やはりそこはですね、しっかりと担保していくという方針でやっております。以上です。
はい、ありがとうございました。それではですね、もう一つ私の方から質問をすいません。中谷さんに追加の質問があるようですね。COVID-19 に関して、途上国のニーズを把握するために、国際社会は何をすべきでしょうかという質問ですが。
非常に大きな質問ありがとうございます。やはり、我々のようなですね、現場に、また現場で臨床試験をやっていたり、現場の研究者、そこからやはり、意見を吸い上げる、今回ですけれども、やはり今回、会議に出ておられる方も人道支援に多く携わっておられる方がいると思うんですけれども、やはりその課題の抽出、それからいろんな立場の人の課題を抽出して、そこでコレクティブにですね、立場を超えて解決策を探っていくと、今回途上国、先進国関係なくですね、皆さんがコロナに影響されているということは一つ、機会という言い方はしたくないんですけれども、一つ大きなチャンスといえばチャンスだと思いますので、そういう機会になればいいかなというふうに思っております。他の先生方もきっとご意見があると思うんですが、どうぞ。
それでは他の先生方、どうでしょう、この質問に対して。COVID-19 に関して、途上国のニーズを把握するために国際社会は何をすべきかということですが、ブリアン先生、いかがですか。
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
COVID-19 に関して途上国のニーズを把握するために国際社会は何をするべきでしょうか。
Okay, thanks a lot for this question. I'm not sure. I mean, what means by global society, but if it's civil society or if it's a global community, but if it's civil society, I think it's what we have seen with this COVID-19 pandemic is that there is an effect on health. And so a good way to understand the effect on health is really to have health indicators, but to interpret those health indicators in context, because sometimes the data collected are just very cold numbers. And one way to understand those numbers is also to really understand also what is behind the numbers. For instance, in certain countries, you have very low cases, but maybe it's because people just don't have access to the healthcare facilities, and so that's why the putting the numbers in context are really important. And I think this is where a dialogue with civil society organization around is really important. The second thing I think it's really important is that we have never been able to combat a pandemic or an epidemic without the contribution of civil society. An epidemic is something that is transmitted from one person to another person, and because it's contagious, it means that it follows a social link. And so you cannot control this transmission without taking into account how people are socially linked. and what are the particular risk factors that those people are facing. So for me, and we have seen in this pandemic, for instance, that certain groups are much more vulnerable to this pandemic than others. And for instance, just one very small example, but you know, some countries have put in place stay-at-home measures, but stay-at-home measures, when you have a household that is multi-generational, and when in the household you have people with underlying conditions and elderly, I mean, you put them at higher risk, basically, of getting the disease. So certain public health measures, for instance, instead of reducing the risk, are increasing the risk. And so that's why it will be the same with those tools, products, medical products. We need, so that's why the civil society is really important to be engaged first, because they need to have a voice, and they need to say what they need exactly. They need also to be informed properly. And I think this information piece is extremely important, because people need to know how the products are made, what are the risks for them, and really a fair and transparent information. And I think here civil society organizations have a huge role to play, to transfer this information, to make it available, to distill the science as well, because we are really talking about sometimes very complex issues like the vaccination, and I think if people are given the right information in the right format at the right time as well, they can also make their own decision if they want the product or they don't want the product, and they can also influence the type of product that is provided to them. And finally, I think that it's very important to engage and empower communities to find the best solution for them. And so this is again what the civil society organization can really do. It's work with communities to find solutions. So it's co-development of solution. And I believe strongly that a certain health aspect of COVID-19 can be overcome even with limited resources, but by having this very open and frank dialogue and co-development of solution with communities. And so there is a lot to be done in this space, I think. And of course, for me, civil society organizations are also here to be some kind of the mediator and the voice of certain communities who cannot necessarily speak out. They are not necessarily well represented in global forums, but they need to have a voice. They need to be heard, and I think it's everybody has something to do about it, to make sure that there is no inequities also in these dialogues. Thanks.
はい、ありがとうございました。それではウォン先生、同じ質問ですが、何かコメントをいただけますでしょうか。
Yeah. Sylvie did actually a very comprehensive sort of answer to that, but maybe let me bring in another element. I mean, I think as we see the COVID pandemic and it is affecting all countries, we shouldn't also forget that for many of the places where MSF works, many of the humanitarian settings in low-income countries, they already have weakened healthcare systems. And I think we need to be very mindful in terms of not only the impact that COVID is having in those populations, but also the indirect impacts. So we need to ensure that actually there are essential healthcare services still provided for other disease areas. We need to ensure those places where you have high disease malaria burdens, places where vaccination coverage levels are just really low. These are the also the other health priorities that we cannot forget about whilst I think everybody is so focused on COVID.
はい、ありがとうございました。それではそろそろ時間が参りましたので、まだまだ議論は尽きないところではありますが、ここでお開きとさせていただきたいと思います。WHO のブリアン先生からは、アクト A による COVAX などのさまざまな対応について、そしてウォン先生からは特に COVAX における疑問点であったり、WTO において、インドと南アフリカから提案されたトリプス協定の一時的破棄の問題など、最新の大変重要なポイントを指摘いただきました。また中谷さんからは新たな試みであるアンティコブを含め、特に新型コロナウイルスに対する薬の研究開発の在り方についてお話をいただきました。これらの新型コロナウイルスに対する薬の開発や薬へのアクセスは特に途上国や貧困層において大きな格差、差別を生み出す可能性があり、我々もこの点をしっかりと認識した上で取り組んでいかなければならない問題であると強く感じました。本日は3名の登壇者の方々、そして参加者の皆様のおかげで大変有意義な時間を共有できましたことを厚く御礼申し上げます。どうもありがとうございました。